When Krishna says that he has no beginning, this is because in consciousness there is no break. There is no beginning and there is no end. He says that since he is imperishable and the Lord of all things, nothing forces him to die or to take birth. Whenever spirituality decays and his purpose is needed, he has to come. Here Mr. T says we have to ponder over the real purpose of Narad Muni. The basic duty of Narad Muni is to implant in the minds of certain individuals, usually leaders, a thought which makes them live up to their destinies and fulfill the karma and purpose for which they have taken birth. This is particularly true when it concerns the destinies of nations. Here, motive is not involved, but it becomes his duty to act in a certain manner. This does not happen in the case of all individuals. Only certain individuals are used with the larger purpose to fulfill the destinies of their nations. But there is a limit or extent of his duty. So whatever Narad Muni cannot accomplish, when Krishna has to reincarnate himself and take birth to come and fulfill that duty, he too is born and he has to look after the destiny of a large part of a certain humanity. Thus he continues that only when each of us, not only theoretically, but really believe from our hearts that I am the divine center, it is only then that each of us can finally merge with him, and only then can each of us take conscious birth and death. Krishna continues that many have merged in him by controlling their passions and weaknesses and desires. Thus, we can all control our major passions and weaknesses like anger, fear, etc. And we might even be successful in controlling them. But the fact that control is still necessary only goes to show that they still exist in us and we are not completely free from them. And then in such a case, the final merger becomes impossible. For this, our very vibrational tone has to be changed so that Krishna tells us in chapter 2, the objects of sense turn away from him. It is only when sense objects turn away from us that we can finally merge in him. Merger only happens when we are purified by the illuminating flame of self-abnegation. Abnegation here means the complete annihilation or utter destruction. Annihilation of what? Destruction of what? Of the ego. We should all self-annihilate our own ego till no shade of ego is left within us, and as a result, even an ant can feel safe in our company. This again is what Christ did when they put a crown of thorns on him and called him a king. But it did not matter to him. The minute our ego is destroyed, the eternal flame within us will illuminate. He continues that it does not matter which path we choose, because eventually we shall all reach him. Thus he says, by whatever path they travel, it leads to me at last. Here he uses at last to mean that some paths could take longer than others, but eventually they all lead up to him. There are no conditions attached as to how to reach him, because he awaits us all with open arms to welcome one and all. Then he goes on to say that those of us who crave success are born again in the same place. But for a man whose ego is completely self-destroyed, there is no question of success. Krishna continues that his actions, like those of Narad Muni, do not bind him because he does them without motive. Once our ego is self-abnegated completely and we perform our actions without motives, then even we can do this. Later he says that in the Satyug, when 100% truth prevailed, more people lived like this, with absolutely no ego and complete self-abnegation. He says that it is necessary for us to know all the aspects of action, because until we know that, we cannot judge or act. To know the secret, that is the law of action, is to act and yet not to be bound by our actions or karma. Then he gives us the most important line of the chapter. Let me read the sutra first. He says in the sutra, it is necessary to consider what is right action, what is wrong action, and what is inaction. For mysterious is the law of action. He goes on to say, he who can see inaction in action and action in inaction is the wisest among men. He is a saint even though he still acts. The wise call him a sage, for whatever he undertakes is free from motive or desire, and his deeds are purified by the fire of wisdom. Having surrendered all claim to the results of his actions, always contented and independent, in reality he does nothing, even though he is apparently acting. Expecting nothing, his mind and personality controlled, without greed, doing bodily actions alone. Though he acts, yet he remains untainted, content with what comes to him without effort of his own, mounting above the pairs of opposites, free from envy, his mind balanced both in success and failure. Though he acts, yet the consequences do not bind him. He who is without attachment, free, his mind centered in wisdom, his actions being done as a sacrifice, leave no trace behind. For him, the sacrifice itself is the spirit. The spirit and the oblation are one. It is the spirit itself which is sacrificed in its own fire, and the man, even in action, is united with God, since while performing the act, his mind never ceases to be fixed on him. In the exposition, Mr. T says, then he gives us the most important line of the chapter. He who can see inaction in action and action in inaction is the wisest amongst men. He is a saint even though he still acts. This can be best illustrated by an example. Take for example two people. One is of a very nervous disposition and the other calm and sedate. If we were to judge them by their outward behavior and actions, then perhaps we would claim the former to be the man of action and the latter the man of inaction. In reality, the opposite could be happening. The former, being nervous by temperament, could be just talking and doing nothing, while the man who seems to be doing nothing could in reality be doing a lot more work and progressing. But the man, he says, who can discriminate this by knowledge and see through these two persons is the wise man, for such a man is not driven by outward impressions. And the person who seems inactive but is really active in his own way, is a saint. Here we should differentiate between the wise man and the sage. The wise man progresses and becomes a sage. He establishes himself through lives that his deeds are purified by the fire of wisdom. Thus a sage is a Maharishi. He is not only pious but also wise, while on the other hand a saint is only wise. Such a man who seems inactive in reality is making a lot of progress. The wise men call him a sage. The wise man knows what the sage knows, but has not reached the stature of a sage as yet, because he has not yet put his knowledge into practice. The wise man, unlike the sage, does not act without motive and has not yet completely abnegated his ego. He has much more to progress through lives to become a sage. This is self-abnegation of the ego once again, because the sage surrenders all claims and results of his actions and considers himself a trustee of all that he is given, and as a result he is independent and content. A successful man, a materialistically successful man, may look independent, but he may be serving many masters. But he is really independent, who has no masters to serve. Thus, even though he is full of action, apparently he seems as if he is doing nothing. Hence, he is not bound by his karma, because having completely self-abnegated, he acts without motives, and like Narad Muni, no fetters bind him. Thus, in reality, the sage does nothing, but he just allows things to happen to him, expecting nothing. This is the clean mind of the Buddha, just living, having passed the mind state. By personality here is meant the sage's physical and astral bodies. These are under control in him by doing bodily actions, as the sutra says. Is meant that he does not act, I'll repeat that, by doing bodily actions only. In the sutra is meant that he does not act as if only his body is working and not his mind, and as a result accumulates no karma. Thus a sage is content, balanced, free from envy, accepting success and failure as it comes. Such a man has even surrendered the fruits of his labor, and if at all he fails, he just sits back and claims what a grand effort without feeling dejected or depressed. Just the fact that we are in this world goes to show that we are tainted, but we should so act so as to remove this taint. Thus a sage lives in such a way that he does not even entertain a shade of thought, however good. He has killed ambition, but he acts like those who have ambition. So it seems as if everything comes to him without effort of his own. He brings in nothing, no success, no failure. So results to him do not matter, because his reaction to consequences is also not there. Thus he says, such a sage is free, without attachment, independent, because nothing binds him, not even a subtle form of attachment. His mind is centered in wisdom. This is the illuminating flame of self-abnegation, because no man is wise without his ego being completely killed. His actions being done as a sacrifice is what the sutra says. Your sacrifice means discipline. Thus he disciplines himself with a smile and willingly, and not as something that is unpleasant and forced on him. In this way, he leaves no trace behind. Thus, he acts in such a way after understanding the law of action, that his acts leave no trace behind. When we burn wood, what is left behind are ashes, but when we burn petrol, nothing is left behind.